Welcome to the sixth panel of the Commission's IP Transition Workshop. My name is David Zesiger, and I'm the Deputy Chief of the Pricing Policy Division of the Wireline Competition Bureau. Our panel this morning will focus principally on the transition of two key intercarrier compensation mechanisms, CAF-ICC support and telephone access charges. The transition to these two mechanisms to an all-IP future. As the record has made clear, properly transitioning these mechanisms will be crucial to ensuring a successful IP transition. I look forward to a productive discussion with our panel this morning. For introductions, I want to invite each of our panelists to introduce themselves and briefly state their organization's positions, particularly on these two issues. And Brian, I wonder if you'd get us started. Thanks.
Happy to do it. Good morning. Brian Benison. I'm with AT&T. Have been working on IP transition and intercarrier comp issues for, most of the 26 years at AT&T on and off. Appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you folks. We, AT&T, given the concerns about aging copper infrastructure and excessive power usage, and the very small percentage of Americans that still rely on copper connectivity, is moving to transition off of our copper network by the end of 2029. We're doing this in a very deliberate fashion, methodical and highly coordinated way, so that our customers all have a reliable new service, that we don't drop anything. In particular, we're very proud that we operate the public safety network, so we look out for our friends in public safety. We have reliable alternatives for 911 and other connectivity like that. We applaud the FCC's efforts to reform these rules and to remove the obstacles, the disincentives that are out there to people moving on. One of the challenges we have remaining is if we are very successful in shutting down our TDM network, we still have multiple carriers that use our TDMs to complete or switches to complete traffic. So in order to complete this transition, we have to solve the problem not just for our customers, but for our partners in the industry. So we are trying to move in a very thoughtful way, and I really appreciated the discussions over the last day and a half where everyone's talking about, hey, this is a whole of industry approach. It's very refreshing to say, hey, unless we get everyone on board, we don't solve the problem.
Hi, my name is Beth. I was with Comcast for 23 years until my retirement in 2023. I've been consulting back to Comcast for the past 2.5 years and appreciate the opportunity to be here and appreciate the motivation of the FCC to tackle these issues. Like Brian, have been working on these issues for multiple decades, and it's good to see some movement here. And also want to echo the collaboration that this is going to require from all the different types of providers within the industry. Overall, Comcast believes that the transition to bill and keep and the phase out of Connect American Fund intercarrier compensation needs to happen expeditiously. There has been a long runway here. People know that this has been coming since the 2011 transformation order. And it seems in a way counterproductive to look at mechanisms that are really aimed at supporting old technology to continue on with those mechanisms when the Commission is trying to get carriers to move away from that old network technology to IP. So again, think this needs to happen expeditiously.
Good morning, everyone. I am Rick Darsey with Pelican Broadband. We are a very small ILEC in Northeast Louisiana, serving about 5,000 subscribers today. I'm very pleased to be part of the panel. I was very honored to be asked to contribute my thoughts on this. With regards to phasing out the Intercarrier Compensation Fund, my company's focus has always been on providing excellent service to people in rural America. Our primary goal is to make sure that we can continue to do that. The reality is these support mechanisms that are in place because the market determined that providing that service to the customers in my area was not viable financially. I want to ensure that any decision that comes out of this ruling and these ideas keeps that focus front of mind. That was codified in legislation years ago. I want to make sure we are able to continue doing that without having to increase costs on customers who really can't afford it on one side and would have a detrimental effect to USF as a whole, because if we start losing people who are using services that our funding pool goes down. So those are my primary focuses. I want to make sure we maintain our ability to provide those services to those customers at a reasonable cost and a reasonable quality. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Tim Boucher. I'm an assistant general counsel at Lumen. I, too, have been working in this area for a number of years and on these issues, and I'm just delighted to be able to participate in this discussion today with this esteemed panel. I hope to continue what I feel like were the good vibes through the panels yesterday as folks shared more and more about their positions. As we do that, I'm mindful of Commissioner Trustee's encouragement for us to not be adversarial. That doesn't need to be a part of it. At the same time, at Lumen, we work a lot on our culture together and how we communicate and relate to each other. One of our main tenets is clear is kind. And so we are trying to be clear, and we'll try to be that today about what we think are the right solutions. Not that Lumen is pure nobility and purity, but we're trying to cut through as much as we can. And Lumen does, I think, bring a uniquely full appreciation for the complex balancing act that we're involved in this exercise. On the one hand, we are one of the largest remaining providers of legacy ILEC voice network and retail services in the U.S., predominantly in a large number of Western states. So we understand rural networks and hard-to-serve areas and the difficulty of moving from TDM to IP on legacy networks. But we also operate a large internet backbone and an extensive fiber network. We are hard at work on a core mission to become, among other things, the trusted network for AI, and we compete as a competitive provider inside and outside of our service territory. As for our work to complete the IP transition, Lumen is doing all that it can, like others, to migrate and deploy IP infrastructure and replace TDM legacy infrastructure. But our efforts have been significantly slowed by a few factors. We've talked in detail about those. I'll just mention two. One is the need to comply with costly and unnecessary 251C interconnection and co-location obligations. And the second is the catch-22 that we've also detailed and other large ILECs have as well, where we have been consistently faced with the demands to accept the TDM LATA base structure and many of the trappings of 251 and 252, where large ILECs continue to be the hub of a hub-and-spoke system of localized interconnection now for IP. We think it just makes no sense to impose an historical TDM infrastructure on IP. That's not how IP networks work and interconnect, and it unnecessarily adds costs in our view. The standoff that type of insistence on replicating TDM network architecture and IP networks creates is causing a real drag on the IP transition. We think it's clear there's a compelling basis for the proposed forbearance from the TDM requirements by the proposed sunset date of January 1, 2029. We also think it's clear the Commission should stand up a new light touch regulatory framework to replace the TDM framework, and that the U.S. Telecom plan, you won't be surprised, is the plan to do that and has distinct advantages over some of the other plans presented. I'm optimistic for many reasons after yesterday's and this morning's discussion, but one of the reasons is I just feel like a lot of the myths about the U.S. Telecom plan have been debunked. Things like it will take longer to put in place than the NTP proposal of Intelliquent, that it's 100% about public internet. Those things have already been discussed. Turning back to the intercarrier comp issues of this panel, we also think there's a strong record that completing the bill and keep transition is critical to and a complementary piece to the IP interconnection work. Remaining legacy ICC rules skew the marketplace and create disincentives to keep TDM. We've talked a lot about that and won't go into that detail here. That was covered in the last panel, but we think that's true for the issues discussed on the last panel, and is also true for some of the issues we're going to talk about in this panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you all for your introductions. I want to get things started with a more general question. As the Commission contemplates making significant changes in its intercarrier compensation regime, it will be helpful to get a clearer sense of where each of the panelists' companies or carriers stand in deploying IP infrastructure in their own networks. We've seen a fair amount of this information in the record, but it would be good to get your additional comments this morning. Also, your thoughts with regard to what additional cost your carrier or carriers will incur to complete the transition. And if we could get started, Beth, maybe with you on this question.
Sure. So Comcast has already made the IP transition largely. Its investments are now really aimed at consistently upgrading those networks and increasing speeds and quality. That does not necessarily mean, however, that we're not affected by the continued existence of the TDM network. A lot of traffic that Comcast sends into the PSTN has to be converted to TDM to exchange with other providers, and that imposes additional costs on Comcast. So really think that as long as there is an incentive to be able to collect some revenue from those mechanisms, that may have some impact on slowing down the transition to some degree.
Anyone else? Thank you.
I'd be glad to speak on the subject. So our network is fully IP. We completed that transition several years ago. At the edge, it is still TDM, mainly due to legacy requirements for TDM interconnection. And we are motivated to move forward with IP interconnection. However, we want to be very cautious in that the current mechanisms that are in place that govern those TDM interconnections are all based on intercarrier compensation and CABS billing. So we have transport circuits that are covered by an ICA that envision billing for termination and origination. If that termination and origination billing goes away, the upstream carrier will want to renegotiate those interconnection agreements. That's going to add additional cost, to your point, what concerns we have, and mainly it will be around transport. How do we get from our network to an IP interconnection point, wherever that may be? We don't know yet, and that's part of the concern I have with the forbearance piece is that until we know what that new network looks like, I don't know that we can answer the question of what the actual impact of phasing out CAF-ICC will be on smaller operators. We depend on that support. We've built our networks based on that concept. I think we need to make sure that before we put a new network in place, that we've addressed all of these concerns to make sure that we're able to continue to provide services through the transition period and then accomplish the goal that I think everybody agrees on that we need to get to, which is IP interconnectivity. On that point, several comments have been made around public internet being the default mechanism for moving voice traffic. I have some real concerns over that, mainly for accountability, and to Tim's point about duplicating existing TDM regulation or PSTN regulation on IP interconnect. I don't think we need to do that, but I do think we need the controls in place to ensure that reliable service is available to everybody.
I may have taken a little more time than the other folks in the initial part. Sorry, David, if I misunderstood the instructions. I think I already covered what we're up to in terms of our IP migration efforts and the kinds of challenges, the primary challenges that we feel like we're running into. Happy to talk about that more, but we'll leave time for other folks.
So I'll go ahead and take a minute on it. And first, I want to wish kind of AT&T a happy 150th birthday. It's in March. It was 150 years since Bell first made his call. And we're dealing with kind of the legacy of that. There's still a lot of copper through the network. We operate two separate networks, even if there's only a fraction of customers on there. As we said, we've moved very deliberately. And I think the biggest challenge for us is, as we said, is we're still passing a lot of traffic in TDM and we're passing it to third parties. So we made a very deliberate and careful plan to try to move everyone as quick as possible. But there's a lot of infrastructure and it's harder and harder to get parts and fix switches. And I guess the other challenge is really we have a lot of our great techs that are retiring after many years. There's a knowledge base that we're losing too. So I think we're very interested in moving this as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to one of the chief questions we have for this panel, the role of CAF-ICC support in the IP transition. In the NPRM, the Commission sought comment on how to gradually phase down CAF-ICC as the industry transitions to all IP. In response, some commenters contend that phasing out CAF-ICC would expedite the IP transition by removing an incentive to perpetuate TDM networks. Other commenters contend that a CAF-ICC phase-down would undercut carriers' ability to transition to IP networks. So I'd like to get the panel's opinions on this dichotomy it seems that we have in our record. And if, Brian, if you get started, thanks.
We realize and appreciate the only way we can successfully make this transition is that no one bears an unfair portion of the cost. We understand, hey, there's a history that's grown up, and as Rick noted, there's the country many years ago decided there were areas that we had to support in order to provide service there. So we do think it's reasonable to take that into consideration as you're looking at this. We were an active participant in the U.S. telecom proposal, and we think that's the right approach, is go ahead and get rid of the inter-carrier comp piece on the schedule the commission proposed, but extend the CAF. And if you need to call it something else, if you need to call it a broadband support plan, go ahead and do that. If they need support to make the transition, to get those last couple of pieces done, we think that should be part of the plan.
So I think irrespective of whether one believes that CAF-ICC has been an incentive or a disincentive to IP investment, I think we've heard from everybody on the last panel that the IP transition has really happened already in end-user networks, even in rural areas. And we've heard that from NTCA reports. And so now I think, as discussed on the last panel, what really needs to happen is IP interconnection. But I think that's something a little separate that could be taking a little more time. I think the transition to bill and keep for inter-carrier compensation should happen on that 2-year timeline, the 24-month timeline that the commission has laid out. But Comcast believes that actually the CAF-ICC, as it is, and as it was created to be, I don't want to say a make-whole mechanism, but semi-replacement of revenues, that's something that should be phased out quickly. It could happen along the same schedule as the ICC transition to bill and keep. Whether there is a need for some other help or funding, some explicit subsidy, that's a different question. But I think CAF-ICC, the way it's calculated and how it was intended, and maybe it's broader in scope than it needs to be for areas that have already made the transition.
I am going to respectfully disagree with Beth on that last point, and that we need a support mechanism in place before CAF-ICC support goes away, particularly for rural carriers. If we lose CAF-ICC and we migrate to bill and keep, we've estimated that our average customer is going to see about a $13 a month increase in service. That's just going to drive them to disconnect that service, which, again, to my point earlier, is going to lower the contribution into USF, which just starts a cycle that I don't think we want to get into. I personally don't think that CAF-ICC has been an impediment to IP. WTA has about 80% of their members are either completely migrated or are migrating to IP, 20% that haven't started. I think that's probably due more to environment or cost for interconnection at this point. The logic that we have to invest in an IP infrastructure in our network, but then convert it back to TDM and maintain that separate network is a bit of a roadblock. If we could get the IP interconnection piece solved so that when they do deploy IP in their network, they can go fully IP, that is really what the roadblock is to me. And we've talked about this, the labor shortages, the skill set gaps that we're seeing today due to the legacy technology. People are retiring out of the industry. Nobody knows how to support this anymore. I would actually argue that maintaining those TDM networks is probably more expensive today than it was 5 years ago. I don't disagree with that, but we don't have a network in place yet that will support it, that would then allow us to ask the question, what kind of support do you need to move to this new network? Transport is a big concern that we have. Roger mentioned that earlier, how the network is designed. One of the concerns I have is if we put traffic on the public internet for voice traffic and it's a 911 call and it routes to 4 other networks, we're basically connecting to a tier 3 network. It goes up to the tier 3 to tier 1 and it's dropped somewhere along the way. Where's the accountability for that drop call live? Because you now have regulated traffic that we're obligated to deliver to 911 that traversed a non-regulated network with no accountability in place. That's a real concern. So those are the things that I would like to see in place before we tell people who depend on that, either inter-carrier compensation or the CAF-ICC, which was supposed to replace that revenue, make sure that they can survive the transition.
I think more data here is critical, but there already is in the record a number of reasons, I think, to think that the CAF-ICC formula is disincenting work to migrate to IP and is insulating incumbent carriers from the financial impact of declining switched access lines. Just a few examples of data to support that. As the NPRM notes, despite the precipitous decline in the share of TDM voice services overall and the driving macro trends of wireless substitution that we're all well familiar with, the decline overall in CAF-ICC funding has been modest, from $426 million in 2015 to $330 million in 2025. That's from the NPRM paragraph 116. So roughly about a 25% reduction. But the decline overall to switched access minutes has been far more dramatic. Industry-wide decline in tariffed originating and terminating switched access charge, this data from the 499 data of the Commission, have dropped from $3.64 billion to about $750 million from 2015 to 2024. So a drop of about 80%. I think that's indicative of something. More fundamentally, if you think about the fact that the CAF-ICC was created long ago as a subsidy program really for TDM switched access costs, I think it's reasonable to question whether it continues to make sense. Can go through the details of that. For us regulatory nerds, it's fun to talk about things like total access revenue requirement and the like, but essentially in setting up the CAF-ICC and the formula that was set back in 2011, the equation was set up so that essentially total access revenue requirement, you start with that, subtract slicks and arcs, and other access and net reciprocal compensation revenue. The remainder is what's eligible for CAF-ICC, simplifying. That remainder would have included the amounts previously received in local switching support in 2011. And recall that local switching support was even longer and longer ago, support for intrastate switching costs that were transferred to the interstate jurisdiction and then offset with USF support. In other words, in a sense, local switching support was the mechanism that was replaced indirectly by CAF-ICC. And in other words, the bulk of CAF-ICC really is to cover legacy TDM switching costs that are going away and being replaced, or should be, by IP networks and more efficient routing. I think all these reasons suggest that the CAF-IC can and should actually go away. But as of today, I think it runs about $324 million, about the same level of what local switching support was in 2011. I think that was about $290 million. So thank you.
Thank you all. And Tim, thank you for the additional detail. That's very helpful. Let's move now to the question of a transition for CAF-ICC. The NPRM emphasized a gradual and thoughtful approach to essentially avoid creating regulatory uncertainty or to minimize impacts on carriers. It sought comment on a 2-year, 3-step transition period following the completion of the transition of remaining access charges to bill and keep. That would provide sufficient time for carriers to upgrade their networks ultimately without that support. I'd like to get each of the panelists' thoughts now on the need for and potential duration of a transition period for phasing out CAF-ICC, and maybe start at the other end, Tim, with you, if we can. Give your thoughts on the proper structure and duration of a transition.
Happy to talk about that. And I want to talk a little bit about probably some more details. The regulatory nerd will keep coming through. Key to understanding how to address the phase out is understanding what really is the continuing need for CAF-ICC. I've already talked a little bit about that, and I think getting a clear record on that is going to be important. And I note that a lot of the record is confusing to some of us on this issue. For example, as some have already touched on, rural ILEC comments say things like, we are largely converted to IP, and then talk about the need to cover IP conversion costs with funding. There are also multiple comments saying that we need to ensure that we can cover the cost of our own interconnection choices, like the choice to use transit, when it's not clear why existing transit costs will change materially given what's already required by those carriers to handle their IP traffic. And so I think it's also really important when it comes to CAF-ICC to not conflate affordability, universal service issues with ICC transition issues. There certainly are a lot of high-cost areas, and the Commission is looking separately at how best to structure high-cost support going forward. But that doesn't mean that all of CAF-ICC is required to keep rates affordable. Again, going to some of the record, there are multiple rural ILEC filings on the record with similar suggested data about the impacts to small carrier pricing and cost recovery. Just taking one example, the Adams et al. Rural ILEC's reply in the ICC proceeding, it describes a median local voice price of $22 with $20.57 in CAF-ICC plus access revenues per line. So a total of $42.57. Even if you add that the purported lost ICC revenue and CAF-ICC revenue to the median local voice, the value is still well below the FCC's reasonable comparability rate, which currently is, I think, at $61.29. To me, this all suggests that CAF-ICC should not exist as an affordability solution. Rather, it should be kept at most as a transitional mechanism to the going forward high-cost solution, whatever that's going to be. And treating ICC CAF as a transitional mechanism avoids letting it also become a hostage to high-cost reform as a result. To get directly to your question, David, from the perspective of all that and the already past 15 years of transitional CAF-ICC, and especially when you bake in the further compromise proposed by U.S. Telecom of 11 more years of CAF-ICC, and also the proposed exclusion of dedicated switched access charges from the bill and keep reform, which will reduce the impact of that on rural ILECs and others, 11 years is clearly more than generous, I think, arguably overly generous on CAF-ICC. So thank you.
As I mentioned earlier, I think the transition on CAF-ICC is going to depend largely on how IP Interconnect is enacted. As an example, we did some modeling on NG911 costs to get to wherever the PSAPs will be located from our networks. We're looking at roughly $50,000 a year in increased expense to provide the transport and the interconnections that are needed to support that. Extrapolating a bit and assuming that the IP interconnect for standard toll traffic would be in approximately the same place, you can now assume that there would be another $50,000 in expense that our company is incurring on services that we cannot increase charges on, and we see no new revenue associated with this activity. That has to be addressed, I think, before we remove what arguably is not supposed to be an affordability program, CAF-ICC, but actually is, particularly in our networks, because it is subsidizing the cost of telephone service to our end users. We had it prior, when the CAF-ICC was enacted, we had intercarrier compensation that was billed directly. So there was revenue there. That was supposed to go away, and CAF-ICC comes in and replaces that revenue, which is a mechanism that it was supposed to do. But the question I have is, okay, over the 11-year transition period, are we supposed to increase cost to the end user, or are we supposed to reduce expense? Which way do we go? Neither one of them is really viable in our networks because we are operating at such thin margins. And we're rural. It costs a lot of money to deliver these services to these customers. We're not complaining about that. We wouldn't do it any other way. We really enjoy what we do. We just want to make sure that we are able to continue doing it.
I want to just latch onto a few things Tim said, and I think in terms of affordability and the network costs, I think you need to have, if there's a mechanism that's going to provide subsidies, it needs to provide the right signals. And maybe this isn't the right signals in terms of what Rick mentioned before and maybe potentially spiraling loss of customers. I understand how that might be an issue, but I don't necessarily believe that's something that should stop the transition. As we know, consumers are cutting the cord everywhere, including in rural areas. We know in a lot of rural areas, there is a good bit of competition from 5G and fixed wireless access. And even these voice lines in rural areas, many of them are transitioning to customer broadband only loops. So I think there are a lot of other variables here that need to be considered when you're talking about what type of fund should be in place and if a subsidy is implicit, like intercarrier compensation or whether you're now looking to your own consumers to recover more of your costs, which is the way these modern networks for voice over IP and CMRS operate today, and how do we get everybody everywhere to that point without obviously throwing away those areas that we know may need some special treatment and some targeted support.
I want to pick up on a couple of things folks have said. One is, Beth, kind of your point about explicit versus implicit subsidies. We think that's a really important issue, that the opportunities for arbitrage on intercarrier, because you have a disconnect between who decides how a call is routed and who pays for that call. That's where the arbitrage opportunity is. I will tell you, I have carriers today who, in order to get originating access revenue, a share of originating access revenue, even though all of their other traffic comes to me in IP, pass that traffic through a competitive tandem, get a revenue share, and then we end up paying for that. They could just pass us all that traffic in IP. So if you want to look for, a specific example of what's slowing down getting rid of this, that's an obvious one in arbitrage that's going on. So making all of the subsidies explicit. To Rick's point, if they have an argument that says, hey, we need this, and the country wants to support that, then they should get that subsidy, but they should be explicit, should be clear what you're getting and what you're paying for. On the 911 concern that Rick raised about traffic going over the Ally model or over the internet, I would say that from our perspective on that and the way we're engineering the network, we think there's a dedicated path to the ESI net that's separate. Essentially, it's a local call. A company could choose to pass it over the internet, but that's a specific decision they're making, and that's a more kind of two-session border controllers pointed at each other, and that would be up to Rick or kind of the other companies to do. So I want to put that one to bed. 911 is not going over the kind of the non-negotiated Ally model. And then the last thing, I think Tim pointed this out, the high cost support is a separate issue. I know the commission's looking at it. I don't want that to slow down the IP transition and intercarrier comp. It's a valid issue that has to be sussed out, but it can't interfere with kind of the work we're trying to do right now.
Thank you all. And that issue will be dealt with after lunch. I have a couple panels for that. Last question on CAF-ICC. Some commenters have suggested recasting existing CAF-ICC support to explicitly fund IP transition costs. And if I can begin with you, Rick, I'd like to get each of your opinions on this suggested approach and to what extent that different approach would translate into a different structure or different timeframes and durations of that support.
Thank you. I think transitioning to a new support mechanism is the right way to go. As everybody's mentioned, we need an explicit support mechanism for transporting this traffic over the network. As far as linked, I'm going to refer back again to, it depends on end state of the IP transit network. How do we end up doing this? If we, to Brian's point, 911 is going to go to a dedicated connection, my preference from an engineering perspective is we do the same thing on voice because it makes it a more reliable, robust service that customers have come to rely on. But there is increased cost with that. So I would think what we could do is begin by modeling what's the network going to look like at that transition point? What will the cost be to get there? And then just come up with a basic subsidy based on those costs, and then time it based on when, whether we think the cost of those interconnections are going to come down. Technology may improve and make it easier to do that or less costly to do that. The IntelliQuint proposed solution is the one I'm most in favor of simply because of this reason. It brings those connection points closer to my network, which reduces the cost. So if we can then design that network the same way, I heard mentioned that Brian's team had come out with another proposal on how to do this, utilizing their existing network. To be honest, getting down into the weeds for a minute, if AT&T was to come to me today and tell me, we will interconnect with you at IP where you currently connect today, I would do it in a minute. We would be done with no additional cost. That infrastructure is already there. But because we don't know where we have to go, we can't answer the question. The only safe assumption at this point is it will incur cost, and we need to determine what that will be.
I think for Lumen, we're not religious about the potential need or the lack of a need for a replacement fund to support cost recovery for investment in IP networks. We definitely see that as preferred to continuing indefinitely the legacy CAF-ICC revenue streams or the ICC CAF funding for the reasons we've already talked about. In terms of amounts or duration or that kind of thing, we think it should be tailored to the record, and a record that shows something is needed to address affordability issues. And we just haven't seen that record yet. And kind of a brief side note digression to that point, I think it's really important to stay laser focused on the issues that are at issue in this proceeding and not. But there was a lot of confusion we were hearing yesterday, and I was glad it was cleared up somewhat in terms of some of the rural ILECs and other types of carriers talking about some of the problems they anticipate with the proposed transition to IP interconnection. They're really about distinct problems that are not really in scope in this proceeding. We heard on the 911 panel yesterday that some purported concerns about the loss of 251C interconnection that really are about BDS pricing, which is not a part of this proceeding, and have nothing to do with 251C, that interconnection legacy. And as we heard on the NERD panel, you can tell I really wish I could be on that NERD panel. We heard concerns about the loss of TDM co-location that are really about commercial co-location needs for data networks. Just really important to stay focused on the record and the issues in this proceeding. Thank you.
Rick, you raised the conditional forbearance proposal we've been working on. Our idea is that we are completely behind the Ally model, the non-negotiated, but we are concerned about the timing to get that out generally to the network. And as we've said, we are moving to shut down our network. We've said we're trying to do that by 29, and we want to shut down our tandems at the same time. So our conditional forbearance proposal essentially has us offering a local IP interconnection at the LATA, and then we would apply for forbearance in that LATA. We've been talking about this generally. We hope folks will like it. We think it, in fact, addresses some of the concerns of the rural carriers about where we would interconnect with you. But it's something we're still working on and trying to get out there. Interested in your take. I'd like to hear that you say, hey, I'd sign up for it today. So I just wanted to expand on that a little bit. We plan to put something a little more fulsome in the record in the near future.
I agree with Brian on the Ally model, and I just think, as he said, the timing of that is not really set in stone right now. It's the phase out of CAF-ICC and the bill and keep transition are really separate and apart from that, something that need to happen sooner. Will all IP interconnection be happening in that period, that of a 2 or 4 year transition for the whole thing? Maybe not. Maybe there need to be other solutions in the meantime. But in terms of anything that might replace the CAF-ICC, I think it's really important that any funding be directed to where there's an absolute showing of need. And there has to be really, I think, specifically defined obligations and timelines. I'm not sure that exactly existed with the CAF-ICC in rate of return areas, so I think that would be important. And just a recognition that there are other mechanisms today that providers are taking advantage of to help fund those IP networks, things like the ACAM and the enhanced ACAM and other high-cost mechanisms.
Great. Thank you very much. We're going to turn our attention now to the other set of mechanisms that the panel will address today, and that is the telephone access charges, modification of which were teed up in the NPRM, where the Commission proposed to eliminate ex-ante pricing regulation and tariffing requirements for all interstate end-user charges, telephone access charges. These charges include SLICs, ARCs, and other charges that you're all very familiar with. So just to get started, maybe starting with you, Brian, what are your perspectives on how the proposed deregulation, de-tariffing of telephone access charges would affect the transition to all IP networks in the near to medium term?
I think we're behind kind of the U.S. Telecom proposal that says, hey, you could do permissive de-tariffing. As we move aggressively to an all IP world, then those charges die on the vine as far as we're concerned. So we are trying to phase them out actively and just make them an explicit part of the customer fee. The one thing to be careful of is if you do mandatorily de-tariff them, and folks have to spend a lot of time looking at older billing systems, reprogramming, that sort of thing, that are really on technologies we're trying to phase out. That's the one risk there as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, as far as Comcast is concerned, it does not charge ARCs or SLICs or any of the other telephone access charges and user charges, but would agree with Brian on permissive detariffing for those charges and anything that sort of moves us closer to companies recovering their costs from their end users, making the markets more even in terms of working consistently the way voice over IP markets work, the way CMRS markets work, and just evening out the competitive space.
This is one of those the devil's in the details questions for me. That cost is already passed along to our end users today. It shows up as a separate line item on their bill. If we're able to maintain that revenue stream in a way that is not perceived as a rate increase by the state public service commissions, I think we could be okay. My concern is it would be seen as an increase because you're moving where the cost is listed. There are limits. In Louisiana, we're limited at 10% per year rate increase. And now we're back in the argument earlier where we have a revenue stream that's going away and it's going to take some time to recover that. And again, going back to my earlier statement about the concern of the amount of churn this may cause, the reality is in rural America, people make decisions based on perception for the most part. Actually, that's not just rural America, that's everywhere. And if our customers perceive that we're increasing their bill without an explanation as to why, it's going to cause some problems. So it really will be how it's done. If I remember right, in the NPRM, there was a statement that it could be kept but could not be listed as ARC or SLIC or whatever it is today. That's really where my concern is, the details on how we do this.
Just to echo what Beth said and some others, Lumen thinks that it clearly makes sense to adopt reforms to telephone access charges, and that doing so can be another important complementary step for the IP transition. We think that because of the vibrant state of competition in the relevant markets, ex-ante pricing and mandatory tariffing requirements just don't make sense anymore. We think and we hope everyone can agree the desired end state, and by gosh, hopefully we're close, is that where all carriers are truly freed from potential constraints, including state law constraints on voice pricing for the combined interstate and intrastate voice services that consumers purchase, so they can price their services with one simple price, just like the rest of the voice service world. In terms of the concerns that Rick raised, I have to say about that, how a proposed reform could add to the challenges of rural ILECs. I'm wrestling with that still. I think legally, if the concern is that the assumption is that rurals would not be able legally to recover those charges, we think that's not legally correct. And it dealt with that a lot in the details of our comments. If the concern is that the market won't bear price increases, that's an issue now. You're not obligated to impose ARCs and SLICs, and you can only charge it as the market allows. And so you raise an interesting question, Rick, in terms of, are there other potential impacts in terms like the need to approach states about issues? Again, I think that goes back to the legal question. I think the way the commission could, and should do the reform of telephone access charges, and we could talk some more about that, would prevent states from doing that LECs would still be able to recover the interstate portion of their voice service needs, because that's something the FCC can assure, and by preemption if necessary.
Thank you all. In the NPRM, the Commission noted the widespread availability of competitive alternatives. Again, picking up, Tim, you're anticipating our questions well. To competitive alternatives to incumbent-like voice service. Alternatives include the ones that have been mentioned, CMRS, interconnected VoIP, over-the-top VoIP, satellite, probably others. Given these alternatives, is there sufficient competition to ensure that voice service pricing will remain just and reasonable if we eliminate ex-ante pricing regulation of telephone access charges? And again, Brian, if we could start with you.
I think what we're seeing, and Tim looked at the FCC's information and pointed out that your telephone minutes are dropping like a stone. So I would say that all of these are substitutes, and it's not even a complete list, that we're seeing a lot of folks moving. So I think there is plenty of competitive pressure out there that would keep pricing down.
Other comments?
I completely agree with that. I think in a lot of places, even in rural areas, that you're seeing, large percentages of areas with 5G, and that's at 100 over 20, and certainly satellite, whether you believe it's the right substitute or not, is fairly ubiquitous. And I think I mentioned before, we even see rate of return carriers, some of their voice lines transitioning over to broadband-only loops. And I think that with respect to that churn, I know it's difficult and there has to be some solutions to cover what those losses might be, but I think that's something that is probably inevitable.
I have a bit of a different take on this. I think we need to ask ourselves the question, what do we envision voice being in 20 years? Is it just another app on your phone and you use all the popular ones out there to communicate with whoever you want to communicate with? If that's the case, then yes, competition would probably suffice to provide what end users need. But I go back to other uses for those services. 911 is a prime example. So assume we move to an environment where traditional voice is over whatever app the person wants to use, but they still want 911 available. That means the network that supports 911 still has to be there in whatever form it may be. And I don't think the market is sufficient enough to provide the funding to support that network. It's very difficult to charge somebody for your emergency service access. I don't think that would fly very well. So I hate to keep pointing back to the fact that the IP transition needs to be considered in all of this. But honestly, there's 4 or 5 NPRMs that are moving through right now. All of them touch on each other in ways that I don't think we fully understand yet. And answering each one of these questions in isolation, we run a risk of causing damage that we didn't understand. So I think if we just transition to app-based calling, yes, the market would dictate it. Broadband would become the service for most people that is supported. That's a whole other conversation because now we get into Title II classification and what are we going to do for that? Because the reality is most of the broadband networks in rural America were built using subsidies for voice products. That's just how it happened. The network was put in place, the copper was put in place where it would provide broadband over that. And then we get programs like ACAM, Enhanced ACAM to provide fiber. They're all, again, subsidized programs to allow us to build those networks. To Beth's point about the move from voice to broadband-only loops, yes, we are seeing that happen as well, but that only happened in our network because the commission took steps to allow that to happen. Prior to that, we were required to charge somebody for voice service. So again, that points back to the voice network has been subsidizing the broadband network that now we're going to turn around and rely on to support voice services, which is somewhat of a circular argument in my mind.
At Lumen, absolutely, we think competition is thriving and that these different types of services, satellite, mobile, fixed wireless, are substitutes. You start with the fact that consumers have made it absolutely clear the technology that they prefer is mobile wireless. Almost 80% of American adults live in wireless-only households. Fewer than 5% of adults are landline mostly or landline only. It's true that there are a few places where mobile coverage isn't robust. There, we think service over low Earth orbit satellites is definitely adequate. Lumen has a new product we're excited about called Connected Voice with Airline that is designed to deliver a traditional telephonics service experience delivered over a mobile wireless connection. It's a little box. You literally plug in your old-fashioned telephone, but instead of connecting over a copper wire, it connects to a mobile provider's network. What's really amazing is when you plug it into a Starlink terminal, it works just as well. You literally cannot tell the difference when the backhaul is provided by satellite, mobile wireless, or even a fiber internet connection. So, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. One more question here on the telephone access charges question. In the NPRM, the Commission proposed a transition timeframe that would allow carriers to de-tariff their telephone access charges either as part of their first or second annual access tariff filings, following the effective date of an order in this proceeding. So what I'd like to do is get a sense from each of the panelists on that timing, proposed timing in our NPRM, and whether that should be, is it appropriate time frame, whether it should be shorter or longer.
I think if you're doing permissive de-tariffing, I don't know why you would limit it to 1 or 2 folks are on a different schedule. We are moving, as we said, very deliberately. But when I first started these conversations with my peers, I think we were ahead of them in some ways. Others are catching up. As Rick pointed out, many of these carriers are well ahead in terms of the transition to IP. We don't think these belong in the IP world in the long run, but I also think that you shouldn't force. If I don't make it in 2 years, do I then not get the opportunity, or are we just waiting for it to die on the vine? So that would go. You should give folks flexibility to do it when it makes sense for their network.
I really don't have much to add beyond that.
And As I mentioned earlier, the details matter. To Tim's point, there's some legal questions there if we can get those addressed, and if it is permissive and done in such a way that we can maintain current customer costs as well as the revenue that we need to continue to operate the networks. The timing is not that critical. It's just making sure that everything has been addressed. So.
Thanks, David. I think I echo what Brian said. I think your question really is directed towards a mandatory detariffing path. At Lumen, we think the Commission can do what it seeks to accomplish here through permissive detariffing. I think if mandatory detariffing is adopted, and whether it's permissive or mandatory, the Commission needs to ensure that state laws don't prevent the sort of one price pricing that's being sought. And the way to do that is to do it through forbearance, which will preempt states and also just make clear that carriers can separately recover their interstate cost pieces. But if mandatory detariffing is the path, we think that more flexibility than the timeline the Commission has proposed does make sense. And we've gone into some detail about what we think would make sense in our comments, but we think making it less rigid than just the 2 years that you're allowed to take steps to will accommodate more the realities of carrier systems and the like.
Sure. Thank you. One follow-up question. If it were permissive, and that's not what we've proposed, what would be the end date or end state, whatever, of these charges? Just a quick comment.
So I guess from our perspective is we think these charges will go away when we get the last TDM customer off our network. So we've said that we're trying to do that. We're hoping to make that goal and planning to make that goal. But I think when you shut down the last TDM switch, you can't charge those anymore.
Other? Thanks.
I think Lumen, we think the timeline proposed in the NPRM will work for permissive detariffing as well. I think it focuses on the mandatory detariffing proposal, but
good. We're getting towards the end of our panel. We'd like just to have some closing remarks for the audience here from each of our panelists.
The best analogy that I've heard of operating the copper network today is like operating a 100-story office building, running lights and air conditioning, but only having 1 or 2 floors occupied. So that's why we're trying to shut down the network, because we have successfully moved many people off, and we continue to do that. We hope to get solutions for every customer as quickly as possible. But there are significant cost savings, and you can lower energy demand by shutting them down.
And I can just add on to that very quickly. I think what we're looking toward here is all the efficiencies that you get with IP networks. It's great for consumers. It's great for networks. And I think it's important to recognize, though, that these networks operate completely differently, and that if you try and impose a legacy type of mechanisms on top of these networks, that's something that is not effective and reduces the effectiveness.
I'll actually segue on that just a bit. Commissioner Trustee's opening remarks regarding complacency and the requirement for a strong regulatory framework to basically enable this transition that we're trying to grow through is a really good point. And I would like to point to an example of why I say that. I'm a bit of a nerd, so I'm going to nerd out here for just a minute. Several years ago, the internet was reported to be running out of IP addresses. So the bodies got together and developed IPv6 and said, okay, we're going to implement this. IPv6 still isn't fully implemented. That's market-driven. And I point that out to say that a market-driven solution to this is not going to succeed in the way it needs to. We need to make sure we have a good framework in place so that all members are meeting the timelines that we need to meet. Because the reality is, if we don't all do this, we're still going to have a problem, just like we do today. There'll be TDM sections within the network that we can't get out.
I go back to where I started, where I covered at the top what Lumen's priorities here are. We think the record is strong to go ahead and grant the forbearance that the Commission proposes in the IP interconnection, NPRM, on those legacy TDM obligations, and that it is a really important potential complementary step to now complete the bill and keep reform, and as part of that, address the CAF-ICC funding and telephone access charges. We think that the proposals out there, particularly U.S. Telecom's compromise proposal on CAF-ICC and intercarrier comp, is really generous. And I'll note, there's been some talk about this, within U.S. Telecom, it's a fairly big tent. And so that proposal comes out of a lot of discussion between very different types of providers, including rural and large carriers. And so there's been support from that from the rural community. I've heard it again in the panels today and yesterday, support of those things. And so I started with good vibes. I'll end with good vibes. I feel like there's just been a lot of positive, constructive discussion, and look forward to more this afternoon.
one last point that Tim put a good list together of all the different pieces there. You guys teed up one issue that's important, but more of a rounding error, which is getting rid of the last obligations for the grandfathered PICs. Trying to account for that in an IP network is problematic. It's important that you guys get that done and appreciate that being in there.
Thank you. That concludes our panel. It's been an excellent discussion. Really appreciate and thank each of the panelists for their contributions today. And I'd ask the audience to acknowledge them. Thank you.